8 billion people in the world today, probably 1/8 of that at least have either zero access to electricity or unreliable access to electricity. So how do you build a digital marketing function in countries that don't have digital infrastructure? In Nigeria and in Africa, where that really has a meaningful role to play, we do a lot of town hall meetings, town criers who come out and are essentially marketing the business to those communities. It feels very last century, but it fits the market and it makes sense and it works effectively. I mentioned earlier that we do appliance sales and credit financing as a way to stimulate demand within our customers and create that customer lifetime value. That has actually proven to be really critical for us in terms of applying that layer of that e-commerce experience across the business.
Today, if you had to pick one of your hardest marketing challenge, what would it be?
So I think there's a few layers of risk that we could talk about.
Welcome to the HEX-Files. Today, I'm excited to welcome William Brent, Chief Marketing Officer at Husk Power. Husk Power is the world's largest provider of renewable energy mini-grid systems operating at scale across Africa and India. William brings a rare global perspective to energy marketing, leading growth in some of the most complex and high-impact distributed energy systems in the world. At Husk, he's focused on customer-first energy access, market education, and transforming residential solar from a complex one-off project into a scalable, repeatable product in energy economies. Welcome, William. Hello, good morning, William. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Arnaud. Good to see you.
So, William, for listeners who may not be familiar with mini grids, can you briefly explain what Husk Power does, who you serve, and why this model is so critical for energy access in emerging markets?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think, originally Husk Power was founded in India about 17 years ago as a mini grid company. Since then, we've evolved into what we just call a distributed energy resource platform. So that includes mini grids, which serve communities. They're basically localized utilities that include a generation asset, plus the transmission and distribution networks to serve those communities. We also have a commercial C&I business unit, which serves C&I off-takers. And then the third piece of that platform is residential rooftop solar. Essentially, we've evolved beyond just community-based power solutions to also serve standalone C&I businesses as well as residential solar. And it was founded by a group of partners from India originally. And so really a mandate from the very beginning of entrepreneurs from the global South trying to address one of the major issues that continue to persist in the global South today, which is access to electricity. And the company originally was founded to do that in India, but always had the vision for trying to do that globally as well, across the global South. So our target regions for focusing are markets in the global South, so Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia. I think we're at 8 billion people in the world today. Probably 1/8 of that, at least, probably more than that, have either zero access to electricity or unreliable access to electricity. So our platform is trying to reach those unserved and underserved customers and trying to solve for that problem and, allow people to access the electricity that will enable everything that modern economies need to thrive and to create jobs and to prime the pump for economic growth in those regions. So that's a brief history of Husk and what it is we're doing today. And our goal by the year 2030 is to use that distributed resource approach to build 2 gigawatts of assets across those 3 different business units in the global South.
So Husk started in India, then went to East Africa. I think I read Tanzania, and now a fast growth in Nigeria. When you think about scaling, what has been harder? Is it to deploy infrastructure, building local trust, creating a repeatable kind of go-to-market model? Where is the hard work here?
We could spend a day talking about that, Arnaud. I mean, we're working in some of the hardest areas to reach in the world. Many of these communities on the mini grid side are rural communities away from the grid, suffering from poor infrastructure, lack of roads. So there are many aspects of the business that we've had to solve for that prevent scale. I mean, I think obviously first and foremost, we're a regulated industry. So unless you have table stakes for us are still the policy and regulatory framework. And if you can't get that framework in place, it's very difficult to operate in those countries. So having, adequate regulation around mini grids and how those integrate into the grid and, what's the structure for feed-in tariffs or residential solar, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all, critically important for us in achieving scale. Without that, we don't go into a market. The other thing that is critical to us, in terms of increasing market share, growing top line, is just access to affordable capital. It's a very capital intensive business that we operate. And, we've seen very clearly that a direct correlation between the amount of capital we have and our ability to grow our top line and scale. So, and that's not a insignificant challenge or hurdle to overcome, especially given that a lot of commercial investors in particular don't particularly find Sub-Saharan Africa and some of the other markets that we operate in particularly attractive as an asset class. So, we've got a lot of work to do and have been doing to try and overcome access to capital, but more, affordable capital, both on the equity and debt side. So those are two things that I would say are critical. And then we've really seen that, you can't just be thinking about, selling electrons as the end of the story here. This is a business where many of the customers that we're serving have never had access to electricity before. And so therefore, in many of those communities, the demand required to make a viable commercial asset and to operate that asset over the lifetime of a mini grid, for example, for 20 to 25 years, you really have to look at the customer very differently. And, we don't see ourselves as, I think, what most would consider traditional utilities, where we're just sending a monthly bill to a ratepayer. And so really trying to think about how do we think of our own company as a customer first, a consumer first enterprise, and really trying to shape our services, our products to meet what the consumer actually needs. And part of that is thinking about customer lifetime value and trying to layer in additionality to the provision of electricity. So, for example, creating that demand through appliance sales and credit financing, which is something that we've been doing for several years, integrating new commercial businesses into the communities that we serve that might be related to e-mobility or agricultural processing and cold storage, and trying to bring additional value to those communities, but also increasing the demand on our assets, right? So that our economics look better. So, really looking at that customer lifetime value has been a critical piece to it. And part of that is also, being able to put the processes in place. We have it's still fairly young, but we have a very robust process quality program within the company. And that program is going to be essential in our ability to scale. Because, if you're building 100 assets and managing those assets, that's one thing. But if you're talking about building thousands, tens of thousands of those assets over a period of time, which is what we're going to do if we build out 2 gigawatts, you can't do that on a traditional model. You really have to invest heavily in technology. So, as well as this process quality that I've been talking about, but, what our investment in AI, for example, our investment in containerized systems that can be deployed much faster, investment in a whole range of different solutions that are required to be able to get to that, tens of thousands of projects. So, I think that there's a lot that I haven't mentioned that I could go into, but I think so those are some of the things that come to mind immediately.
So you're developing a technology for scaling. You're addressing residential, commercial needs, and you have a long-term asset life. What is your revenue model? How do you get those end users to pay for that electricity down the road?
Right. So, it's a fairly complex business that we're running, and it's part of the complexity comes from the fact that we're operating in different types of markets, right? So the India market, for example, is very different from the Nigeria market. So, you really have to look at each of one of those things independently of each other. I mean, the underlying technology, the underlying business model doesn't shift that much from region to region and country to country. But from a marketing perspective in India, you got high penetration of digital currencies, you've got high penetration of smartphones, the ability to use those for the business are available. In Nigeria, that's very different, right? Not to mention the fact that you're dealing with different cultures and different types of, approaches to service provision, et cetera. So it's complicated, but at the highest level, from a mini grid perspective, that community power that we provide, basically a utility model. It's a prepaid model, so everybody pays at the beginning of the month. We collect revenue at the beginning of the month. People can top up during the month if they need additional electricity. For commercial and industrial, I think we've moved significantly in the past couple of years more to a PPA model. So we're looking for credit-worthy off-takers who need solar power plus batteries to offset diesel costs in most cases. That will create a large amount of savings for them. So that's essentially a subscription model where they're paying us a fee on an ongoing basis. So we have recurring revenue from the mini grid business, we have recurring revenue from the C&I business, and we have recurring revenue from residential as well. All of the assets for C&I and mini grids are assets that we typically own. For residential solar, it's slightly different model, but we also do provide O&Ms to those homeowners on an ongoing basis for a period of time. So it's pretty straightforward. Collection of the revenue can be also vary from market to market, but we've solved for that through a variety of different ways. So not all of our revenue is cashless. It's all paid through mobile money primarily. So I think we've been able to ensure that we've got a very clear idea of what our demand looks like, and also a very clear way to collect that revenue on an ongoing basis.
So you're the chief marketing officer for Husk. So I mean, definitely your role as a CMO is a bit different than maybe what would be the role of a standard CMO in another type of utility. What makes your marketing mix? What makes your job challenges? Where do you spend most of your time? What you say from a marketing standpoint?
So I think that our vision is to really create a digital infrastructure that allows us to be digital first in terms of our marketing, and as much as possible through sales as well. I mentioned earlier that we do appliance sales and credit financing as a way to stimulate demand within our customers and create that customer lifetime value. That has actually proven to be really critical for us in terms of applying that layer of e-commerce experience across the business. And so, as much as possible, we're trying to turn customer acquisition into a purely digital journey for the customer. So we invest heavily in digital where we can. So in India, for example, we are essentially trying to lower our customer acquisition costs through these digital channels, whether it could be Instagram or WhatsApp, whatever it may be, so that we can pass on those savings to our customer at the end of the day, and increase our LCOE. I haven't talked about levelized cost of energy, but that's a critical metric for us as a company, both on the CapEx side and the OpEx side, and we do a variety of things to optimize for that over time. Yeah, so I think, the idea and what we've seen to date actually is that, we started the business in India, and what we've been able to do successfully is transfer that knowledge, that know-how, that expertise to Africa. And, we can't do all of that yet in Nigeria or other countries in Africa that we expect to expand into, but it's the vision of the future, right? As smartphone penetration continues to grow in sub-Saharan Africa, all of the work that I'm talking about, what we're doing on the digital side in India, will be transferred to our markets in Africa as well. For the time being, it's mostly a below the line marketing strategy for those African markets because of the absence of the penetration of smartphones, et cetera. So, we're doing a lot of below the line in Africa, less so in India. And, but again, I think the vision is very much based on how do we continue to rely on digital, reduce our customer acquisition costs, and automate as much as possible so that we can scale further.
You mentioned below the line, and you mentioned also digitization of sales. So I have two follow-up questions here. Can you, if you, the first one is if you can describe a little bit more what you do below the line, and then you mentioned digital marketing and digitization of sales. Where do you think, how is the alignment between kind of what you do from the marketing side and from the sales side? Where does it stop? Where does it start?
So on the below the line, I'd say that's primarily still in Nigeria and in Africa, where that really has a meaningful role to play. It could be as simple as branding the communities that you serve with the Husk brand, making sure that you have a high recall for the customers that you're serving. It could be we do a lot of town hall meetings, where we're actually bringing stakeholders from the communities in these rural areas together on a regular basis. We have village power committees that we set up in each community that meet on a regular basis, and that brings various stakeholders from the community, youth, women, small businesses, into be able to engage with them on a one-to-one basis. And there's some marketing aspects to that. Town criers who come out and are essentially marketing the business to those communities. So it still feels, it might sound to some listening that it feels very last century, but it fits the market and it makes sense and it works effectively. In terms of India, as I said, we invested in e-commerce to do our appliance sales and credit financing business. And through that process, we learned a lot about how to acquire customers digitally. And now we're applying those learnings to residential solar, for example. We have a sub brand called Beam, which is our residential solar brand. And, essentially we're using an app and the website as the funnel for attracting potential customers. We're vetting those customers using, AI algorithms that we've developed for the e-commerce business. And, through that process and working with the CRM team, essentially narrowing down that funnel to customers that we think are convertible. So, I think it's a work in progress to, fully flesh that out further. But we've seen, our customer acquisition costs already go down. And, in terms of sales and the role that sales and marketing play together, again, it depends on the business unit. So, the segmentation work that we've done for our mini-grids business provides clear articulation of who our target customers are for the sales team, what the USPs are for that sales team. They also, there's a ground up sort of dynamic here as well, where we're gathering insights from the ground, from the sales team, laddering up to market that allow us to customize the offering based on a variety of scenarios. You could say, what's the marketing strategy to try and sustain demand during the harvest season or during the rainy season? So we rely heavily on the sales team to be able to provide that level of insight that we can then integrate into our marketing strategies. I talked about residential solar. For C&I, it's really, it's mostly marketing support for sales, right? Traditional, whether it's the development of collateral or bringing together customers. It's a very hands-on business. So it doesn't, it's not surprising that that's still largely a hand-to-hand combat type of marketing approach, unlike the residential solar and the mini-grid business.
And so if you're looking at the shape of your marketing team, from what I'm hearing, there's a pretty strong tech aspect from the app development, the CRM team. Can you tell me a little bit about how your marketing team is structured, whether it's structured internally or externally?
So currently, it's almost 100% internal. I worked for a marketing services agency for a decade, part of the IPG group. And, as someone who was previously a consultant providing marketing services to clients, I guess I was never 100% a believer in that model. You've got high overhead from the agencies that you're working with externally. They do give you some flexibility, especially if you're organizing things on a project basis. But we've chosen to grow our marketing function primarily internally, and we look at it two ways. I oversee global brand marketing and communications. So we haven't talked about brand, but that's also something that's critical for us, given that we see ourselves as a customer first business where, there's a lot of competition and, building trust over time is really important. But from a marketing perspective, I think the corporate marketing piece I manage with a small team and, it's probably 5 people. And then, we have product marketing teams as well that are locally based in the countries where we operate. And so they have a dotted line to me and a direct line to whoever's running that business unit in the country itself. So we tried it the other way, and we found that it made more sense to localize those functions and make sure that there's ongoing integration and consistency and alignment between corporate and the business units, but really freeing up the country teams to manage those marketing campaigns and strategies and tactics and all of that stuff at the local level. So I mean, we've been hiring so much lately. I don't even know what the size of those teams are, but in India, it's significant. That's still our largest market. In Nigeria, it's growing very quickly as well. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it at the moment, and it potentially could evolve in the future as well. But we've tried both approaches, and this one seems to be working really well.
You're mentioning brand, brand awareness and kind of the competitive landscape. And you mentioned in our course of our conversation, multiple kind of brands you have for different markets. What is the competitive landscape and what are you doing from a brand perspective at the moment?
So, we've been really laser focused on growing our top line, growing the business, deploying more assets. They hired me, the CEO, Manoj, who's from India and a longtime friend. He understood clearly when they hired me 5 years ago that there was a need for a marketing function within the company. I didn't have to go and sell anybody at the executive level that brand marketing communications was value. I mean, there's plenty of data to support the investment in brand and the return on that investment from a company performance basis as well as valuation basis from investors. But I fortunately didn't have to scale that wall. It was already there. It had been removed for me before I joined the company. And so they saw the value very early on of all of those things. And so, it's allowed me to have a lot of flexibility in terms of what we're doing. Now, what's our budget sort of gets back to the original point, which is that we've been laser focused on deploying assets and not so much to date on investing in brand to the degree that I would like to see, or that Manoj, our CEO, would like to see as well. I mean, I think we've been able to grow the business. Compound annual growth over the last 4 or 5 years has been above 60%. So we're growing the business quite well. But we all know that further investment in both the parent brand as well as some of the sub brands would also have a positive impact on the things that I mentioned, valuation, et cetera. So I think this year we're in the process of raising $400 million. And, that follows a round that we raised in 2023 of $100 million. With that amount of money, we're putting in a much larger budget for brand and marketing this year. Is it still to the degree that it probably should be? No, especially it depends. I mean, I think we already have a strong leadership position in the community solar business. The mini grid business, I think we're clearly recognized as the leading global brand, whether it's governments, whether investors. We can still do more on the customer front, and we should, and we will. But, in the residential solar business and C&I, those are much more, I'd say, mature markets where competition is fiercer. So you really have to be, very clear about how you're going to market for both of those business units. And again, I think, the budget for marketing, branding is still relatively low, but I'm really looking forward to having some leeway starting, after this next round is raised to be able to do a lot more on that front.
And how much of your CMO job is spent in actually interacting with that investment community to do this big raise of almost $500 million?
So my function by title is Chief Marketing Officer, but that marketing piece also includes the strategic piece of marketing, right? Which countries do we enter? How do we enter those countries? So I'm quite involved in that aspect of the business, and I've been working hand in hand with our CEO and our CFO for the past 3.5 years on the financing side as well. So I typically refer to myself as the top of the funnel for fundraising. I'm very good. I'm a pretty good salesman aside from the marketing function that I play. And I've done a lot of my own fundraising as an entrepreneur in the past, where I've started several companies or co-founded several companies in the past. I've raised money, both commercial and concessional. So, I have a lot of experience there. And it's been a large piece, actually, of my job over the past 2-3 years, especially. And I enjoy that. I enjoy that piece of it. And, we're still a growth stage company. So we step in and do things where needed. I've been leading work on gender and what's our gender policy. I've been leading our work on impact and how do we measure impact and report impact. So for me, that's fun. I like having my fingers in a lot of different pies. And so the fundraising piece is definitely something that I've been heavily involved in.
Today, if you had to pick, one of your hardest marketing challenge, what would it be?
There's some things that we can't control. I'd love to be able to wave a magic wand and have every consumer in Nigeria have a smartphone tomorrow. So how do you build a digital marketing function in countries that don't have digital infrastructure? So that's something that I think a lot about. And, what are the partnerships that can be put in place to solve for that problem? But I think one of the things that I'd say gives me a lot of, it's frustrating. It's also exciting, is that, you either have too much data or too little data. So, in more mature markets like India, we have a lot of data that we are trying to analyze as much as we can. And there's multiple sources, multiple tools, multiple, solutions in a marketing stack that can access that data. How do you use that data most effectively? I think that's something that I think a lot about, where we have access to data. In Africa, the problem is that we don't have access to data. I mean, it's a very data poor. These are very data poor markets, and even where you do have data, it's not good quality data. So, making informed decisions based on poor data, garbage in, garbage out, that's a big issue. And so I don't think we've really cracked that so far, and that applies both to the customer, but also to the more strategic aspect of marketing that I was talking about. If we're thinking about entering a country and we don't have good macroeconomic data, then data that will help us to evaluate non-commercial risks that are beyond the control of the business, that's an issue, right? And same with the customers as well. We don't have these customers on our digital app, customer-facing digital app that we've developed. And so therefore, we don't have as much robustness or granularity of data that we would like. So I'd say that data piece is for different reasons, it's still something that we're trying to get our heads around a little bit more, depending on the market. It varies.
And you mentioned risk. I've, been working in some emerging markets and in Africa also, in more of a, oil and gas aspect. But there is, a lot of risk assessment, and there is positions within those organizations, a chief risk officer, etc. Do you have this function at Husk? How do you assess risk, whether it will be physical risk to your assets or financial risk? I mean, based on the economy or political situation within those countries you're entering.
So I think there's a few layers of risk that we could talk about. I mean, there's demand side risk from the customer, and how do you manage for that? And, some of those, so making sure, so we have a very clear articulation within the company about the community where we build assets, right? We don't invest a penny unless we have a very clear idea upfront about what the return on that investment will be. And we've developed an algorithm for scoring different communities that has informed how we've actually built our systems. All of our systems, for mini grids anyway, are standardized. Same size, same distribution network. All of those things are standardized, and it's based on a specific customer mix. It's based on a specific demand profile, based on a bunch of other inputs that feed into that algorithm. And that allows us with great confidence to de-risk an investment before we make it. It's because we're already quantifying what that demand risk is for the community. So I think, we have a scoring system that does that. And if the score for a community comes back above a certain percentage point, we have a 90% certainty that that site will be profitable within 18 to 24 months, let's say. And then those types of approaches obviously de-risk for us. In terms of non-commercial risk, I think part of it is that, the perceived risk and the actual risk, often there's a disconnect there, right? So some investors will perceive a certain risk in a market based on what they know, but in fact, the risk is oftentimes much less than that. And the IFC has done some research on that sort of proves out that point. But commercial investors are still, much more interested in more mature markets. The United States, maybe less so now, but Europe, and getting them to even think about Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is very difficult. India's fine. I mean, India you can raise affordable capital and commercial capital, but Sub-Saharan Africa is very difficult. And then you do have a lot of political risk, right? So you look at ways to hedge that risk through political risk insurance, like from the likes of the World Bank, where you can get some sort of sovereign backstop, basically, to, in case there's expropriation or things like that. So, depending on the type of risk, we address it in different ways. From terms of currency risk, which is also a risk, devaluation in Nigeria, for example, has been off the charts the last couple of years. So obviously looking at ways to use currency hedging mechanisms, or preferably to find affordable long-term local currency debt that gets around that risk as well, is also really important for us. So, I think we don't have a chief risk officer yet. At some point it may make sense to do that, but I think we're still, not quite to the scale yet where that makes sense. In the interim, it's, the executive team that's essentially a small group within that executive team that's assessing what is the attractiveness of different markets, and also, continuing to build out additional ways to de-risk assets that we're investing in through AI, through, other algorithms that I talked about in terms of scoring different business opportunities and making sure that they match our return profile, et cetera. So, we're approaching it for a few different ways.
Oh, thanks. Looking ahead, the next 3 to 6 months, can you give us a bit of where is the next market, and what's the next big move?
So, as I mentioned, we have a target of 2 gigawatts of assets by 2030. A large chunk of that will come from India and Nigeria. We have a strong pipeline for both countries across the business in those 3 units that I talked about. But we've made a commitment as a company at the Africa Climate Summit in 2023, I want to say, to enter I think it was 5 additional countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. We've looked at DRC, we've looked at Madagascar, we've looked at a number of other Sub-Saharan African countries, both in East, Central, West, and Southern Africa. And, I think that's still the goal, is to, we know that we can't achieve that 2 gigawatt number without some sort of inorganic growth. And so, whether that's through M&A, through partnership to enter new markets, that's definitely going to happen. And there's also the potential to enter another market in Southeast Asia. I think there are a couple of island countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, that are ripe for these types of distributed energy solutions. And that may be something that we'll look at more closely as well. We've already evaluated a couple of different opportunities, and, same thing in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the goal. I think let's say we get to, a gigawatt by 2028, the goal is to then try and take the company public in 2029. And then, continue to use public markets for, ongoing capital needs as we grow further.
Well, thank you very much for all this information, Wliiam. I think it's been a very interesting for me conversation. For listeners who want to learn more about Husk Power or connect with you, where the best place to find you?
Yeah, so we just launched this new platform in December. As part of that, we revised our website, so huskpowersystems.com. We have, 60,000 followers on LinkedIn, so that's a good place to access information about the company as well. We have a quarterly newsletter that people can sign up to from the website, the homepage. And, we're on social media as well. So if you're an Instagram user or, any of the other things that are more consumer focused, we're also there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today, Wliiam, and we'll talk soon, okay? Thank you.
Arnaud, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone listening to the HEX-Files. If you're curious how your organization stacks up across strategy, marketing, sales, and technology, you can take our growth optimization survey at hexagroup.com/podcast. It's a quick way to spot gaps and opportunities. Until next time, fear no more. The truth is out there.